Mrs. Maisel went to my high school, not in real life, but in the show, so I always felt an affinity with her. Hi, I'm Julie Satow, and I'm the author of When Women Ran Fifth Avenue, and today I'll be discussing department store scenes in movies and TV.
Once we get them into the store, the rest is kind of up to you.
Mr. Draper, our store is 60 years old. We share a wall with Tiffany's. Honestly, a coupon?
I love it. Such attitude. The real Rachel Menken was Beatrice Fox Auerbach, who was this firecracker department store owner whose father had died, much like the Rachel Menken in Mad Men. She was known as being so fierce and such a control freak. She used to walk around with like her hands in white gloves and run her fingers on the underside of all the shelves to make sure people had dusted them. But she was also this amazing person who, during the 1940s, for instance, she was one of the first department stores in 1942 to hire African Americans as salespeople, which was not very common at all. And her store was the biggest store in Connecticut, in Hartford.
It works for Chanel.
Menken's is not Chanel.
That's a vote of confidence.
This is ridiculous.
Don.
I'm not gonna let a woman talk to me like this.
I also really appreciate the way Don Draper calls her, a woman, a girl, takes such umbrage at her knowing her own product. I think that a lot of the women in my book and a lot of the women I researched did have to deal with that exact dynamic where they were second-guessed and questioned, even though they were the ones with experience.
If you want your sister courted, brother wed, or cheese imported, just leave everything to
I love the music choice. This is B. Altman's, which was one of the first department stores to actually open along Fifth Avenue. It was a very fancy department store. There were mail shoots. People definitely corresponded with stores via mail, requesting things, especially if you didn't live in New York. You could also call the stores, for instance, as these women are answering all the phones and directing them to various salespeople or managers. You could call in your orders. You could specify what you wanted. You might see it in a newspaper advertisement and say, I saw you were advertising this pair of gloves and I want it in this color, and they would send it to you.
Be Altman, where may I direct your call? I will connect you. Be Altman, where may I direct your call? I will connect you. Be Altman, where may I direct your call?
This was in the era before we had direct telephone lines, so you would call the central operator, which is what these women are doing here, and they would put you through to the various lines. So it was hard work, it was confusing, and it was crazily busy, although like most things with TV, I definitely think this is a little bit of an exaggeration. I don't think they were dealing with quite so many calls.
Try manning the Revlon counter on a free makeover Friday. Makeup counter? Yep.
You were in the show. What's it like? I hear there's music and lunch breaks and air.
It is all of that and more.
It's true that there definitely was a hierarchy to the sales jobs at department stores, and being in the basement and working the telephones was not the most glamorous position. It was probably one of the least glamorous, but being at the counter, at the makeup counter, was definitely one of the higher positions you could have as a saleswoman. The more expensive the items were that you were selling, the more money you would make. So yes, being a makeup girl selling lipsticks was definitely considered really glamorous.
But until then, be Altman, where may I direct your call?
I feature in my book a lot of stories of saleswomen who began as dust girls, for instance, just dusting merchandise, all the way to becoming buyers. Buyers were the most powerful positions. They actually would take trips to Paris. They would decide what would be bought in the various departments. So if you were a buyer for dresses, you would go and watch all the fashion shows and decide which dresses you wanted to order for your department. So that was the top, the highest echelon position. And certainly there were women who started out at the very bottom and made it to buyer. That was part of what was so amazing about the world of department stores, because that's really unusual for women, especially in these years, to be able to have those kind of careers. And buyers would make a significant amount of money. They could make the equivalent of, $200,000 a year. Department stores were kind of these places where women would get dressed up to come shop. It was a place where you would go with the whole family and the kids would come, especially during the holiday seasons, because obviously there were amazing shop windows and displays and Santa Claus.
I wonder if you might help me find this doll for my daughter.
bright Betsy. Oh, she cries and wets herself. But I'm afraid we're all out of stock.
Toy departments were de rigueur in all department stores. They were huge moneymakers. Often they even came with like nurses, so you could drop your children off with these babysitters that were called nurses and go shopping elsewhere.
Oh, she looks like you, around the eyes.
You think so? What did you want when you were this age?
A train set.
Okay, obviously there's other dynamics going on in this movie, but definitely shop women, shop girls were very helpful back then and super knowledgeable, so it's not totally crazy that she would help her pick out a doll with a lot of, you know, personal interaction like that. Being a saleswoman or a shop girl, as they were known back then, was definitely a very good job. It often came with like training. You could rise through the ranks, you could take courses. They would sometimes pay for you to go to school afterwards. The hours were really long, usually, but department stores had their own dining rooms. They often had their own recreation areas. So after your shift or during your shift, you could go get a free lunch. You could go, you know, throw a ball around on the roof. A lot of them had like yards up top. So it definitely had its perks, but it wasn't all perfect. Harry Selfridge, who was a real person who actually worked for Marshall Field's, which was an old department store that people might be familiar with in Chicago. He really made Marshall Field's be what it is, which it was an incredibly successful department store. And then he moved to London and he realized that in London, they didn't have these kind of department stores that they did in America. So he opened Selfridge's, which became a very successful department store. It's still around, and it's really a deep dive into what store life was like, so it's really fun.
Summer at Selfridge's. What'd you think?
I love it.
What I love about the show is that it really does show how glamorous and beautiful department stores once were, how they were this world of fantasy where you could really buy anything. You could even have any service you want, from a marriage plan to a funeral. So it really kind of evokes that feeling, that atmosphere.
We save the best for last.
Thanks for watching, and if you want to know more stories about the real women in department stores, pick up my book, When Women Ran Fifth Avenue.